You know how people say nothing good happens after midnight? I used to laugh at that. I'd worked the night shift for years, and the worst thing I'd ever seen was a raccoon getting into the dumpster behind the loading dock. But that was before I took the job at the old Merriwick Industrial Complex, before I learned that some things are better left unseen, and some footage should never be I took the job because I needed the money. That's how these stories always start, right? I'd been laid off from my last gig, bills were piling up, and my landlord was starting to leave notes on my door that weren't exactly friendly. So when I saw the ad, night security needed, immediate start, no experience necessary, high pay, I didn't think twice. I called the number, and a woman with a voice like gravel told me to come in for an interview that night. No background check, no references, just show up. The Merriwick complex was a relic from another era. A sprawling maze of brick warehouses and empty offices, all surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, with broken windows and weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. But the pay was good, almost suspiciously good, and I figured I could handle a few creaks and groans from an old building. My first night I met the day guard, a guy named Frank. He was in his 60s, with a face like a weathered leather boot, and hands that shook when he handed me the keys. "You'll get used to it," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Just do your rounds. Keep an eye on the cameras. And don't go poking around where you don't belong." He didn't elaborate, just clocked out and left me standing in the tiny security office, surrounded by monitors that flickered with grainy black and white images of empty hallways and shadowy corners. The first few hours were uneventful. I walked the perimeter, checked the doors, made sure the gates were locked. The place was dead silent, except for the occasional clang of pipes or the distant hum of machinery that hadn't run in years. I settled into the rhythm of the job, sipping bad coffee and watching the monitors, half expecting to see a stray cat or maybe a couple of teenagers trying to sneak in for a dare, but nothing happened. Not that night, or the next, or the one after that. I started to relax, even enjoy the solitude. There was something peaceful about being the only person awake in a sleeping city, the only witness to the slow crawl of time between midnight and dawn. Then, on my fourth night, I noticed something strange. One of the cameras, camera 12, covering the old loading bay, kept flickering, the image warping and distorting like a bad VHS tape. I tapped the monitor, thinking it was just a loose connection, but the picture didn't clear up. Instead, it got worse. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing just outside the pool of light cast by the security lamp. Tall, thin, with arms that hung too low, and a face I couldn't quite make out. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe a smudge on the lens. I made a note to check it on my next round, but when I got to the loading bay, there was nothing there, just empty concrete and the echo of my own footsteps. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. The rest of the night, I kept glancing at camera 12, half expecting to see that figure again, but the screen stayed empty, the shadows still. The next night the same thing happened, flickering, warping, shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. This time, I saw something else, a shape darting across the far end of the loading bay, too fast to be a person, too big to be a rat. I rewound the footage, but the tape glitched, skipping over the exact moment I wanted to see. I told myself it was just old equipment, nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started to notice other things, too. Doors that I knew I'd locked standing open when I made my rounds. Footsteps echoing in empty hallways. The faint smell of something burning, even though the power had been cut to most of the building years ago. I mentioned it to Frank when he came in for the morning shift, but he just shrugged. "Old buildings do weird things at night," he said. "Don't let it get to you." But it was getting to me. I started to dread going in, my stomach twisting with anxiety as the sun went down. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just tired, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I started carrying a flashlight everywhere, even though the hallways were supposed to be wet. I double-checked every door, every window, every lock. But no matter how careful I was, things kept happening. One night I found a set of muddy footprints leading from the back door to the security office. They were too big to be mine, and they stopped right outside the door, as if someone had been standing there, listening. I checked the cameras, but the footage was blank, the screen filled with static. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the footprints had vanished, wiped away as if they'd never been there. That was when I started keeping a journal. I needed to keep track of what was happening, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Every night, I wrote down everything I saw, every strange noise, every flicker on the cameras. The entries started out short, just a few lines here and there, but soon they filled pages, my handwriting growing more frantic as the nights went on. The journal became my lifeline, a way to anchor myself to reality when everything else felt like it was slipping. I started to notice patterns in the chaos. The flickering on camera 12 always started at exactly 2:13 a.m. The smell of burning wax drifted through the east hallway only on Tuesdays. The muddy footprints appeared every third night, always leading to the same spot outside the security office, never away. I tried to rationalize it, to find explanations that made sense, but the more I wrote, the less sense it all made. One night I decided to test a theory. I set my phone alarm for 10 a.m. and sat in front of the monitors, eyes glued to camera 12. The seconds ticked by, my heart pounding in my chest. At exactly 2:13, the screen flickered, the image warping into a mess of static and shadow. I leaned in, holding my breath. For a split second, the figure appeared again, tall, impossibly thin, its face a blur of shifting darkness. This time, it turned toward the camera, and I swear it looked right at me. The screen went black. I jumped back, nearly knocking over my coffee. When the image returned, the loading bay was empty. I rewound the footage, but the tape skipped, the moment erased. I checked the other cameras, but nothing was out of place. The rest of the night passed in a haze of anxiety, every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge. The next morning I confronted Frank. I told him everything, the figure, the footprints, the glitches in the cameras. He listened in silence, his face unreadable. When I finished, he sighed and rubbed his temples. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "Every guard who's worked here has seen something. Most don't last more than a week. They quit, or they just disappear. The company doesn't ask questions. They just hire someone new." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "What is this place?" I asked. "Why does this keep happening?" Frank shook his head. "No one knows. The complex was built on old land, back before the city even existed. There are stories about fires, accidents, people going missing. Some say the ground is cursed. Others think it's just the buildings settling, old pipes and bad wiring. But I've seen things, too. Things I can't explain." He paused, glancing at the monitors. "If you want my advice, don't go looking for answers. Just do your rounds, keep your head down, and don't let it get to you. The less you notice, the safer you are." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in his voice made me stop. He sounded tired, beaten down by years of secrets and silence. I nodded, promising myself I'd take his advice. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what was happening, even if it meant putting myself at risk. That night, I came prepared. I brought a thermos of strong coffee, a fresh notebook, and a small handheld camera. If the security footage kept glitching, I'd record what I saw myself. I set up in the security office, eyes glued to the monitors, waiting for 2:13 a.m. The minutes crawled by, each tick of the clock echoing in the silent room. At 2:13, camera 12 flickered, the image warping into static. I grabbed my camera and started recording the monitor, my hands shaking. The figure appeared, closer this time, its face still a blur, but its eyes, if you could call them that, were two pits of darkness, endless and hungry. It raised one long arm, pointing directly at the camera. The screen went black. I stared at the monitor, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When the image returned, the loading bay was empty. I checked my camera, but the footage was corrupted, the screen filled with static and distorted images. I tried to tell myself it was just a malfunction, but I knew better. Something was in that building, something that didn't want to be seen. The rest of the night was a blur. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt like a threat. I barely made it through my rounds, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out of the building, exhausted and shaken. I thought about quitting. I really did, but something kept pulling me back. A need to understand, to see it through. Maybe it was pride, or maybe just stubbornness. Either way, I showed up for my next shift, determined to get answers. The next few nights were more of the same. Flickering cameras, strange noises, the feeling of being watched. But then, things escalated. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, echoing off the walls, always just out of sight. I started walking faster, my heart racing. The footsteps matched my pace, growing louder, closer. I broke into a run, sprinting down the hallway toward the security office. The footsteps pounded behind me, impossibly fast. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The footsteps stopped. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath, listening. Silence. I checked the cameras, but the hallways were empty. I rewound the footage, but the tape glitched, skipping over the moment I'd been chased. I sat there for the rest of the night, too afraid to leave the office. The next morning, Frank found me still sitting there, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking. He didn't say anything, just handed me a cup of coffee and sat down beside me. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound, the hum of the monitors. Finally, he spoke. "You should leave," he said quietly. "This place, it changes people, makes them see things, do things they wouldn't normally do. I've seen good men lose themselves here. Don't let it happen to you." I wanted to listen. I really did, but I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not until I knew the truth. I started digging. During the day, I scoured the internet for any mention of the Merriwick complex. Most of what I found was dry, old business records, property transfers, a few news clippings about layoffs and bankruptcies. But buried in the archives, I found something that made my skin crawl. A series of articles from the 1970s about a string of disappearances. Workers who'd clocked in for the night shift and never clocked out. The police had investigated, but nothing ever came of it. The company blamed poor record keeping, and the cases faded into obscurity. There were rumors that stories about strange lights, voices in the walls, shadows that moved on their own. One article mentioned a fire in the East Wing, but the cause was never determined. Another described a worker found wandering the grounds at dawn, muttering about the watchers and refusing to go back inside. He quit the next day and left town. No one ever heard from him again. I printed out everything I could find and brought it to work, spreading the papers across the desk in the security office. Frank glanced at them but didn't say a word. I could tell he'd seen it all before. Maybe he'd even lived through some of it. That night, I decided to do something reckless. I waited until 2 a.m., then left the safety of the security office and made my way to the loading bay. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and dust, the only light coming from the flickering security lamp overhead. I stood in the center of the bay, heart pounding, and waited. At 2:13, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air, even though it was the middle of summer. The shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping across the concrete toward me. I heard a whisper so faint I thought I was imagining it. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but empty air, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I backed away, my hands shaking, and hurried back to the security office. When I checked the cameras, the footage was blank. The entire loading bay was swallowed by static. The timestamp frozen at 2:13. I tried to record it on my phone, but the screen just showed a mess of black and white lines, like the signal was being jammed. I wrote everything down in my journal, every detail I could remember. The cold, the whispers, the sense of dread. I tried to make sense of it, to find a pattern, but the more I wrote, the less I understood. The next night, I brought a small tape recorder with me. If the cameras wouldn't work, maybe I could at least capture the audio. I set it up in the loading bay, hidden behind a stack of crates, and went back to the office to watch the monitors. At 2:13, the same thing happened. The camera flickered, the image warped, and the figure appeared, closer this time, almost at the edge of the light. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay put, watching as the figure raised its arm and pointed at the camera. The screen went black. When the image returned, the bay was empty. I waited until sunrise, then retrieved the tape recorder. My hands shook as I pressed play. At first, all I heard was static. Then, beneath the noise, a faint whisper. I turned up the volume, straining to make out the words. It was my name, over and over, whispered in a voice that wasn't quite human. My name repeated again and again, growing louder, more insistent, until it was a scream. I dropped the recorder, my heart racing. I wanted to run, to quit, to never set foot in that building again. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was so close to understanding. I started to see the figure in other places, too. Reflected in the glass of the office door, standing at the end of the hallway, lurking in the corners of my vision. Always watching, always waiting. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my rounds. But it was always there. Frank noticed the change in me. He didn't say anything, but I could see the worry in his eyes. One morning, as he was clocking in, he handed me a small, battered book. "Found this in the lost and found," he said. "Might help." I opened it and found page after page of handwritten notes, journal entries from previous guards. Some were short, just a few lines about strange noises or flickering lights. Others were longer, filled with frantic scrolls and desperate pleas for help. One entry caught my eye. If you see it, don't look away. If you look away, it gets closer. If you run, it follows. If you hide, it waits. The only way out is through. I read the entry over and over, trying to make sense of it. Was it a warning? A set of instructions? I didn't know, but I copied it into my own journal, just in case. That night, I decided to follow the advice. When the figure appeared on camera 12, I didn't look away. I stared at the screen, forcing myself to meet its gaze. The longer I looked, the clearer it became. Its face was a shifting mass of shadows, eyes like empty voids, mouth twisted into a silent scream. It raised its arm, pointing at me, and I felt a cold hand close around my heart. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around me. I heard the whisper again, louder this time, echoing in my mind. My name, over and over, until it was all I could hear. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The screen went black and the figure was gone. I gasped for air, my body shaking with adrenaline. I checked the time. 2:17 a.m. 4 minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. I wrote everything down, every detail, every sensation. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I was getting closer to the truth. The days started to blur together. I slept in fits and starts, haunted by dreams of endless hallways and flickering lights. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of my name still ringing in my ears. My friends stopped calling. My family's texts went unanswered. I was obsessed, consumed by the need to understand what was happening at my... One evening, as I was getting ready for my shift, I noticed something strange. My journal, the one I'd been filling with notes and observations, was missing. I tore apart my apartment, searching every drawer, every shelf, but it was gone. In its place, on my kitchen table, was a single sheet of paper. On it, written in shaky handwriting, was a message. "You're not alone." I stared at the note, my mind racing. Was it a threat, a warning, or something else entirely? I brought it with me to work, tucking it into my pocket like a talisman. When I showed it to Frank, he just shook his head. "It's starting," he said quietly. "You need to be careful." That night the building felt different. The air was heavy, charged with static. The lights flickered more than usual, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I made my rounds, flashlight in hand, every sense on high alert. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, each turn leading me deeper into the maze. At 2:13, I was in the East Wing, far from the safety of the security office. The temperature dropped, and the smell of burning wax filled the air. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, shining my light down the hallway, but there was nothing there, just the echo of my own fear. I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps followed, always just out of sight. I tried to ignore them, to focus on my route, but they grew louder, more insistent. I broke into a run, sprinting through the maze of corridors, desperate to reach the office. As I rounded a corner, I slammed into something solid. I stumbled back, raising my flashlight, and found myself face to face with the figure. It was taller than I remembered, its face a swirling mass of darkness, its eyes two bottomless pits. It reached out, its hand impossibly long, and touched my shoulder. The world went silent, the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure leaned in, its mouth inches from my ear. I felt its breath, cold and damp, as it whispered my name. Then, just as suddenly, the light snapped back on. The figure was gone. I was alone in the hallway, my heart racing, my skin cold with sweat. I stumbled back to the security office, locking the door behind me. I sat there for the rest of the night, staring at the monitors, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When the sun rose, I found another note on the desk. This one was written in the same shaky handwriting. "Don't trust the cameras." I stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. The cameras were my only link to the outside world, my only way to see what was happening in the building. If I couldn't trust them, what could I trust? I decided to test the theory. That night, I left the security office and made my rounds without looking at the monitors. I relied on my flashlight, my instincts, and the map I'd memorized over the past few weeks. The building felt different, quieter, almost peaceful. The shadows didn't seem as threatening, the air not as heavy. But as I passed the loading bay, I heard a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a clear, unmistakable voice calling my name. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The voice came again, closer now, echoing off the concrete walls. I turned, shining my light into the darkness. The figure stood at the edge of the bay, its face still a blur, its eyes locked on mine. It didn't move, didn't speak, it just watched. I forced myself to keep walking, refusing to look away. The figure followed, always just out of reach, always watching. I finished my rounds and returned to the office, my nerves frayed, my mind racing. When I checked the cameras, the footage was normal. No glitches, no static, no sign of the figure. It was as if nothing had happened. I wrote everything down, every detail, every sensation. I was starting to see a pattern. The more I relied on the cameras, the more the figure appeared. The more I trusted my own senses, the less power it seemed to have. I shared my theory with Frank. He listened, his expression grave. The cameras don't show you the truth, he said. They show you what it wants you to see. That's how it gets in your head. That's how it finds you. I asked him what it was, but he just shook his head. No one knows. Some say it's a ghost, others think it's something older, something that's always been here. All I know is, the more you look, the more it sees you. I didn't sleep that day. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my mind. I was scared, more scared than I'd ever been. But I was also determined. I wasn't going to let it win. I wasn't going to let it drive me out. That night I left my phone, my flashlight, and my notebook in the office. I walked the halls in darkness, relying only on my memory and my instincts. The building was silent, the air thick with anticipation. I felt the figure watching, felt its presence in every shadow, but I refused to acknowledge it. When I finished my rounds, I returned to the office and found a third note on the desk. You're getting closer. The message rattled me. You're getting closer. Closer to what? The truth. The edge of madness. I didn't know, but I felt it in my bones. Something was building. A tension in the air that grew heavier with every passing night. I started to notice things outside of work, too. Shadows that lingered too long in the corners of my apartment. The feeling of being watched as I walked home in the early morning light. Once, I caught a glimpse of a tall, thin figure reflected in a shop window, only to turn and find the street empty. I tried to talk to Frank about it, but he was growing distant, distracted. He'd started coming in late, leaving early, barely saying a word. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his eyes hollow. One morning, I found him sitting in the break room, staring at nothing. It's getting stronger, he whispered, almost to himself. It knows you're not afraid. That night, I decided to push further. I brought the battered book of old guard journals with me, flipping through the pages as I sat in the security office. Most of the entries were rambling, disjointed, but a few stood out. Warnings, advice, desperate pleas. One entry, dated nearly 20 years ago, caught my eye. If you want to see the truth, go to the basement, but be warned, once you see, you can't unsee. The cameras won't help you down there, only your own eyes. I'd never been to the basement. Frank had told me it was off limits, that the door was always locked. But that night, as I made my rounds, I found the door standing open, a faint light spilling out onto the concrete floor. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity, and maybe something darker, pulled me forward. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air was cold, damp, filled with the scent of earth and old stone. My footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound swallowed by the thick silence. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a long hallway lined with rusted pipes and broken light fixtures. The only illumination came from a single bare bulb, flickering at the far end. I walked slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were covered in graffiti, strange symbols, names, dates. Some of the writing looked fresh, as if someone had been down here recently. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the grooves carved deep into the concrete. At the end of the hallway, I found a heavy metal door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, windowless, filled with old filing cabinets and stacks of yellowed papers. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a monitor, an old, boxy CRT, humming softly. I approached the monitor, my reflection warped in the curved glass. The screen was filled with static, but as I watched, an image began to form. It was the loading bay, seen from a strange angle, as if the camera were hidden in the ceiling. The figure stood in the center of the frame, its face turned toward the lens. It raised its arm, pointing, not at the camera, but at me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stepped closer, its face filling the screen. Its eyes were endless, swirling voids, its mouth a gaping maw. I felt a pressure in my head, a buzzing in my ears. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The figure's gaze held me, pinning me in place. I felt memories slipping away, my childhood, my family, the sound of my own name. All that remained was the figure, the endless darkness of its eyes. Then, just as suddenly, the screen went black. The pressure lifted, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. I scrambled to my feet and fled the room, racing up the stairs and back into the main building. When I reached the security office, I found Frank waiting for me. He looked worse than ever, his skin pale, his hands trembling. "You went to the basement, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. He closed his eyes, a look of resignation on his face. "It's too late now. Once you see it, it never lets you go. You have to finish what you started." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he was already gone, slipping out the door and into the dawn. I sat alone in the office, the weight of his words pressing down on me. The next few nights were a blur. The figure appeared everywhere, on the cameras, in the hallways, in my dreams. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, my journal filled with frantic scribbles, desperate attempts to make sense of what was happening. The notes kept appearing, each one more urgent than the last. "Don't look away. It's almost here. You have to choose." I started to realize that the figure wasn't just haunting the building, it was haunting me. It fed on my fear, my curiosity, my need for answers. The more I searched, the stronger it became. One night, as I sat in the security office, the monitors all went black at once. The lights flickered and died, plunging the building into darkness. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, and the figure stepped inside. It stood in the doorway, its eyes locked on mine. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me, but I didn't look away. I forced myself to stand, to face it. "What do you want?" I whispered. The figure didn't speak. It just watched, its gaze endless and unblinking. I felt memories slipping away again, but I held on, clinging to the last shreds of myself. Then, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it spoke. "You have to choose." I didn't understand. Choose what? My mind raced, searching for meaning in the chaos. The figure stood motionless, its presence filling the room, pressing in on me from all sides. The air was thick, suffocating, and I felt the urge to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and face it. But I remembered the warnings and the journals, the desperate scrawls of those who came before me. If you run, it follows. If you hide, it waits. The only way out is through. So I stood my ground, heart pounding, sweat beading on my forehead. "What do I have to choose?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady. The figure tilted its head, as if considering me, and for a moment, the room was silent, except for the distant hum of the building's old pipes. Then the monitors flickered back to life, each one showing a different part of the complex. On one screen, I saw Frank, wandering the hallways, his face blank, eyes wide and unseeing. On another, I saw myself, sitting in the office, staring at the screens, a look of exhaustion and fear etched into my features. Other screens showed empty rooms, long-forgotten storage spaces, the loading bay, the basement door. But in every frame, somewhere in the shadows, the figure was there, watching, waiting. The voice came again, softer this time, echoing in my mind. "You can stay, and become part of this place, or you can leave, and take me with you." The choice was a trap, I realized. If I stayed, I'd become like Frank, another lost soul, wandering the halls, haunted by memories and shadows. If I left, I'd bring the figure with me, spreading its influence beyond the walls of mirror. There was no escape, no easy answer, only consequences. I thought of the guards who came before me, their warnings and pleas. I thought of Frank, broken and hollow, trapped by a choice he never understood. I thought of myself, desperate for answers, willing to risk everything for the truth. And I realized that the only way to break the cycle was to refuse the choice altogether. I turned away from the figure, refusing to meet its gaze. I walked to the door, my legs heavy, every step a struggle. The figure didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me, cold and relentless. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily in my hand. As I stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of burning wax, and I heard whispers all around me, my name, over and over, growing louder with every step. I kept moving, refusing to look back, refusing to give in to the fear. I made my way through the maze of corridors, past the loading bay, past the basement door, past the places where I'd seen the figure lurking in the shadows. The whispers followed me, growing more frantic, more desperate, but I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, until I reached the front doors. They stood open, the night air cool and fresh on my face. I stepped outside, the weight of the building lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But as I walked across the parking lot, I glanced back at the Merriwick complex. The windows were dark, the building silent, but in one of the upper windows, I saw a flicker of movement, a tall, thin figure, watching me leave. I didn't stop, I kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the empty lot. I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I started the engine, the radio crackled to life, a burst of static filling the air. Then, beneath the noise, I heard a voice, my own voice, whispering my name. I drove away, the building shrinking in my rearview mirror. The road was empty, the city asleep, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I tried to go back to my old life. I got a new job, moved to a new apartment, changed my number, but the shadows followed me. I'd catch glimpses of the figure in reflections, hear whispers in the dead of night. Sometimes I'd wake up to find notes on my kitchen table, written in that same shaky handwriting, "You can't run forever. It's still watching, you have to choose." I started keeping a journal again, filling page after page with my memories, my fears, my desperate attempts to make sense of it all. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that the story wasn't over. The figure was still with me, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a presence I couldn't escape. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me. Maybe it's always been there, waiting for someone to notice, someone to see it for what it really is. Maybe it feeds on curiosity, on fear, on the need for answers that can never be found. All I know is that I can't go back. I can't undo what I've seen, can't unmake the choice I refuse to make. The Merriwick complex is still there, waiting for the next guard, the next curious soul to walk its halls. And somewhere, in the darkness, the figure is waiting, watching, whispering. If you ever find yourself working the night shift, alone in a building that feels too empty, too quiet, trust your instincts. Don't look too closely at the shadows. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, don't watch the cameras for too long, because some things are better left unseen. And some stories never really end.